The Synchro Mystic presents Synchro Mystique. Washington, D.C. has a split personality. On the one hand, the District of Columbia is crowded with splendid architecture. From the intricacies and grandeur of the Library of Congress and Washington Union Station, to the unmistakable spectacle of the faux Egyptian Washington Monument, more on which in a future installment, and ultimately to the stately dignity of the Capitol Building, National Archives, and White House. Pharaonic princes and ancient Roman senators alike would doubtless have felt at ease in the United States' nerve center, which could probably be read as political commentary in itself. On the other hand, as the sun sets on the nation's capital, a different and more ominous aura begins to envelop many of the landmarks and tourist attractions. In a few locations, an atmosphere of otherworldliness appears to prevail entirely. It is within the halls of these unhappy structures that, some say, ghosts walk the corridors of power, reliving old disputes and remembering sorrows long forgotten by the living. According to one editorialist writing in 1891, Washington is the greatest town for ghosts in this country. Admittedly, a pressing question is, why? But before one can even begin to get a handle on that difficult inquiry, the prior and much more basic issue is simply, where? So in this video, the first of a planned series on DC-related oddities, we'll sketch some of the places within the district that are the most regarded, or feared, for their paranormal activity. As a prelude, we'll remind viewers of our past treatments of Blair House, also known as the President's Guest House. For instance, in our presentation on the synchro mystique of the name Blair, we noted the electrifying news item about how Blair House was the scene of an assassination attempt on 33rd U.S. President Harry S. Truman, November 1st, 1950. Or again, in 9/11 Synchronicities, we noted that 42nd POTUS, William Jefferson Bill Clinton, had been relocated to Blair House when, late September 11 or early September 12, 1994, one Frank Eugene Corder stole a Cessna and crashed it into the White House, killing himself. For our purposes, we're more interested in talk of the more unworldly goings-on at Blair House. One website declares, guests of the auspicious presidential guest home have reported numerous sightings of unexplained apparitions, including that of President Truman himself. One of the two structures on our list that will be instantly recognizable to many people all over the world, the Capitol Building, is the meeting place for the United States Congress. It was also the site of the J6 shenanigans and their ensuing, highly politically divisive aftermath. But apart from representatives and senators, the People's House is reputedly also home to a variety of otherworldly residents, some allegedly relics from the building's history. Take, for example, the case of a stonemason who, during the Capitol's construction, had the misfortune to be plastered into a hardening wall. Legend holds that the man lost an argument with a brick-wielding carpenter, who then used the mason's own trowel to seal his tomb. A point of literary interest, though in the quite different setting of Italy, is of course the short story The Cask of Amontillado by Edgar Allan Poe. In Poe's tale, the aristocrat Montresor walls up his chained rival, Fortunato, leaving him to die. Back at the Capitol, dark stains on the marble steps of the House Gallery, connecting the chamber's first and second floors, mark the site of the murder of Kentucky Representative William Preston Taulbee, and perhaps the Capitol's most chilling mystery. The identity of the shooter isn't the question. It was most certainly the journalist and fellow bluegrass state transplant Charles Kincaid. To make short shrift of the long-running beef between the two men, Kincaid publicly humiliated Taulbee by accusing him first of corruption and then, later, of an adulterous liaison with a young patent office secretary. Whether Kincaid was an idealist or simply ambitious will have to be left to a higher authority, but the facts seem to be that the articles cost Taulbee his political career and possibly his marriage. Becoming a lobbyist, Taulbee remained on Capitol Hill and, towering over the diminutive Kincaid, allegedly sustained a campaign of physical abuse against his antagonist. Provoked beyond endurance, Kincaid ended the quarrel by putting a bullet in his tormentor's face. No, the disturbing puzzle is just why, after 135 years and multiple chemically augmented scourings, pale red splotches said to be the remnants of Taulbee's lifeblood remain visible on the steps where he fell. Capitol workers swear that they have seen and heard the congressman's spirit lingering at the spot, supposedly still seeking revenge on journalists who are advised to steer clear of the spot. Now, a blood-stained staircase is creepy, but perhaps the most terrifying of DC's phantasmagoria is the so-called demon cat. As one writer put it, the Capitol's phantom feline puts any other black cat story to shame. In Statuary Hall, in the hours between prime time and we, guards say that they've seen a small, shadowy black cat approaching. As they get closer, it grows geometrically, swelling to giant tiger size. As it reaches the frightened observer, it pounces, and then disappears. No word on whether or not this legend lies behind the name of one popular DC area nightclub. On a more tragic human interest wavelength is the tale of Major Pierre Charles L'Enfant, the designer of the city of Washington, D.C. History reveals that this talented but temperamental engineer was never adequately paid for the services he rendered, and he died penniless. His ghost, looking distraught and hungry, resides in the Capitol and wanders about the basement. And every time someone starts making noises about changing the layout of the city or about beautifying it in some way, L'Enfant's ghost appears and begins strange and fitful noises. Or consider the case of 6th U.S. President John Quincy Adams. As discussed in our video 10 Milestones in Election Fraud, he only served a single term as head of the executive branch. After his defeat by Old Hickory, Andrew Jackson, in 1828, Adams became the only ex-pres to move to the House of Representatives. By the way, Andrew Jackson's deep, throaty, spectral laughter is said to echo even still in the Queen's bedroom from within the White House, which structure we'll get to momentarily. But for 17 years after 1831, John Quincy Adams served as a representative from Massachusetts, until, on February 21, 1848, Old Man Eloquent, as Adams was called, had a stroke at his desk in the Capitol as he was protesting the Mexican-American War, which had just ended. Adams hung on for 2 days. Ultimately, however, he died in the office of fellow Massachusetts Congressman and House Speaker Robert Charles Winthrop. To this day, legend holds that a transparent figure resembling Adams can still be seen occasionally roaming Statuary Hall and gesturing as if in the throes of a disputatious speech. We won't probe the depths here, but as a foretaste of some of our planned follow-up videos on DC's darker secrets, consider some of the Capitol's curious ornamentation. While not exactly ghostly, it is certainly mysterious enough that a meandering, swastika-like design was at one time embroidered into the seat cushions of the House Visitors Gallery. Given that the upholstery has likely been changed periodically, it is all the stranger that these patterns should have been such a conspicuous part of the backdrop during the J6 brouhaha. Similarly, and more highly political, are the giant Roman-style fasces, or fasces, displayed on either side of the prominent dais in the House chamber below. Although we registered this fact in our 1968 video, the fasces' conspicuous placement is nevertheless resolutely ignored by countless politicos and milliards of media types, many of whom spend careers denouncing the supposed fascism of their political opponents. House curator Farrar Elliott is on record gushing, quote, "I love the fasces because all these little rods were bound together in ancient Rome. Little rods that individually you could snap. Put them all together and they're awfully strong." End quote. As destiny or synchronicity would have it, who but our ill-fated 16th president was serving his one term as representative from Illinois at the time of Adams's demise? Perhaps this was a strong enough dose of synchromojo to explain why it is said that Abraham Lincoln's ghost haunts the White House. Such is the 16th president's synchro-mystique that there are reports of strange goings-on in the catacombs beneath the Lincoln Memorial, which Undercroft, according to a 2023 article in the Smithsonian Magazine, is also the site of a new underground museum. And if you go, you might want to bring a flashlight. One Paul Hodges of the Washington Post decades ago wrote that one night after Rangers had locked the doors to the underground areas, they found the doors open again. When they turned off the lights, they found them on just a few moments later. And when they turned them on, they saw them go off. A thorough search found no evidence of human habitation, and it seems to be more than anomalies in the electrical system. As for Honest Abe's alleged incorporeal antics in the president's house, it is worth recalling that both he and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, grieving over her son Willie's death on February 20th, 1862, began to participate in spirit circles, or seances, in the Red Room at the White House. Not to be outdone in the apparition department, 3rd U.S. President Thomas Jefferson has reportedly been heard practicing his violin in the Yellow Oval Room. According to the White House's Historical Association, some claim that the 10th President, John Tyler, haunts the Blue Room, and the specter of Dolley Madison, the wife of 4th President James Madison, apparently likes to haunt the Rose Garden, to which she is said to have a special connection. Then there are the claims of Mrs. Lillian Rogers Parks, who spent 30 years on the White House staff. She once felt a terrifying, coldish presence while hemming a bedspread in the previously mentioned Queen's bedroom during the Eisenhower administration. But she didn't stick around long enough to see what it was. Woodrow Wilson was noted for several things during his tenure in the White House. Many of them not so good, according to critics. For instance, Wilson presided over the institution of the Federal Reserve and the federal income tax. He also attempted to enroll the U.S. into the ranks of the League of Nations, predecessor to the United Nations, just to name a few common complaints. But as mentioned most recently in our video 1968, Wilson was also part of the history of the 25th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which, among other matters, specifies procedures for vice presidential succession in the event that the commander-in-chief becomes disabled. You see, in October of 1919, Wilson suffered a massive stroke that left him half paralyzed and, in hindsight, obviously incapable of discharging his executive duties. Thus, until the end of his term, in 1921, his second wife, Edith, took unprecedented control over the Oval Office. The extent of her decision-making and influence are still largely unknown. Edith was at least a sort of gatekeeper who filtered information to and from the White House, with the assistance, it should be noted, of the president's doctor, Navy Admiral and Surgeon Cary Travers Grayson. But by 1921, the ailing Woodrow Wilson moved to a mansion off of Washington's Embassy Row. Close associates reported that the former president was troubled by lapses of memory and unpredictable crying spells. Wilson was dead within the span of 3 years. But in this unsettled state, Woodrow Wilson's spirit may yet linger, shuffling throughout his old neo-Georgian house in Kalorama Heights neighborhood in northwest Washington, D.C., or sobbing from indistinct corners, or rocking in his customary chair. At least, some say. Stephen Decatur Jr. was an 18th to 19th century Navy admiral and hero of the Barbary Wars and the War of 1812. Eventually attaining the rank of Commodore, he is best remembered for two things. Firstly, in terms of his military exploits, Decatur led a daring raid in a harbor off the African nation of Tripoli. The objective, which was accomplished, was to destroy the USS Philadelphia, an American warship that had been captured by Barbary pirates. The idea of the destruction was to render it useless to the enemy. But secondly, and much more tragically, Decatur is known for having lost his life at the age of 41 in a pistol duel with another Navy man, Commodore James Barron. Barron had been court-martialed for bad leadership and substandard preparation when his ship, the USS Chesapeake, was overtaken by the British vessel HMS Leopard. Decatur had been one of the members, essentially like jurors, who had decided Barron's guilt and punishment. Barron thus bore the younger Decatur a grudge. For Decatur's part, the duel was unwanted. He had surely thought by that time in his life that his fighting days were over. But just before dawn, March 2nd, 1820, Decatur slipped out of the back door of his home, carrying his dueling pistol in a black box beneath his arm. Hours later, friends bore him home with a fatal wound, and he died at 10:30 p.m. In fact, the story has more intrigue than this too-quick summary lets on. It turns out that the seconds, Jesse Elliott for Barron and William Bainbridge for Decatur, had selfish, ulterior motives. This seems to have led them to conspire to arrange the particulars of the duel in such a way as to practically guarantee the deaths of both participants. And this nearly occurred, as both Barron and Decatur were shot. Barron, however, survived. Decatur's widow, Susan, referred to the supposed friends as assassins, and for years she spent considerable energy trying to pursue some measure of justice. In any event, the ultimately senseless stupidity of his inevitable tragic demise weighed heavily upon Decatur as he lay bleeding to death. He had no heirs, and although he left his widow all his worldly possessions, at least one source asserts that she ultimately died penniless. Thus, within a year, Decatur's melancholy spirit was reported at the window where he had stood the night before his death, and, according to some, Decatur haunts his old digs even still. In fact, the specter of Stephen Decatur was spotted so frequently in the window of the naval hero's home that the windows had to be bricked up. Of course, cynical historians believe that they were always fake windows for visual balance, or some such thing. But to hear many visitors tell it, that has not stopped the adumbral Decatur from appearing at the walled-up windows anyway, with an expression of melancholy and a capacity for raising goosebumps. Incidentally, Decatur House stands on the northwest corner of the synchromistically significant Lafayette Square, directly across from the White House. The present study gives us many opportunities to mention the powerhouse Lafayette name, which we intend to make the focus of an upcoming presentation on the underlying Fayette factor phenomenon. So, stay tuned. After the White House and the Capitol, the Octagon House is perhaps the most prestigious of the many haunted buildings in the city. Its stature seems matched by its controversies. For example, indisputably, it has unique architectural features, which, however, are standardly regarded as somewhat miscalled, as the building is routinely said to have 6 sides rather than 8. However, as another commentator writes, it is arguable that it does have 8 sides. It's just that they're not equilateral. This creative justification is plausible, provided that we count the curved and straight portions of the facade separately, alongside the other 5 flanks. More relevant for us are the many disagreements about the building's history and allegedly supernatural characteristics. According to many, 2 daughters of Colonel John Taylor III, bosom buddy of George Washington and builder of the place, had an unlucky penchant for toppling over the railing of the spiral staircase that runs from top to bottom of the house. Both of them are supposed to have died in that way in fits of romantic agony during love affairs with suitors of whom Papa did not approve. At least, so goes an oft-told legend. Critics insist that none of the Taylor's daughters died in the Octagon. Rebecca Plater Taylor did die in 1815 at the age of 18, but it is asserted that at this time the Octagon was being rented by President Madison, and the Taylor family was supposedly staying at its Mount Airy plantation in Richmond County, Virginia. Google is no help here, for amusingly, its experimental artificially intelligent search bot can't seem to make up its mind on this point. Depending on the question one poses, it sometimes agrees with the legend, and at other times, with the naysayers. Then again, as one Live Science article put it, chatbots are, in a technical sense, bullshit machines. Then there's the story of a slave girl who is supposed to have jumped from the stairwell to escape the attentions of a British officer. The officer jumped too, and both were killed. Another version says that the slave girl was killed by the soldier, who then proceeded to wall her body up in the house. Sounds familiar. If you ask museum staff, various workers at the house have reported all the standard indices of haunting: feeling chills in various locations, hearing strange noises, including crying, footsteps, and groans, sensing an unidentifiable presence behind you, etc., etc. especially in relation to the possibly cursed stairs. For example, according to Wikipedia's article on the house, museum superintendent Alric H. Clay claimed that in the 1960s, spirits would often turn on the lights and open the Octagon's doors late at night. Journalist John Alexander relayed the story of caretaker James Cypress, whose ailing wife's doctor claimed to have encountered a man on the stairs, dressed in a military uniform of the early 1800s. When there was no costume party nor any other earthly explanation for his presence or his costume. Quite recently, there have been reports of encounters with Dolley Madison's spirit, which, if we recollect stories of her ethereal visits to the White House Rose Garden, must mean that her ghost really gets around. More striking, however, are the myriad dramatic reports that seem to underscore the house's alleged predisposition to foment youthful self-destruction. For example, Mrs. Belma, or Velma May, one-time curator of the Octagon Museum, claimed to have seen its big chandelier swing of its own volition, while all windows in the foyer were tightly shut. And on another occasion, accompanied by porters, she claims to have found tracks of human feet in the otherwise undisturbed dust on the top floor, which had long been closed to the public. The tracks looked to her as if someone were tiptoeing across the floor. It was from that spot, recall, that at least one daughter of Colonel Taylor supposedly jumped. Periodically, caretakers have observed that the first-story carpet, evidently now removed for unknown reasons, once had a tendency to flip up at the spot where the doomed girls supposedly landed and died in the early 1800s. Viewers will have no doubt heard of the Amityville House, some 260 miles to the northeast of D.C., and subject of several books, as well as a commercially successful horror movie franchise, including in 2005, for what it's worth, a version starring the now A-list Hollywood actor Ryan Reynolds. But the real-life Amityville structure was the scene of a grisly crime when, on November 13, 1974, a then 23-year-old Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr. shot to death his father, mother, 2 brothers, and 2 sisters at the family home in the suburb of Amityville in Long Island, New York. The evil deeds may have been caused by, or perhaps they opened up, some sort of spiritual portal to the infernal realms, a connection that supposedly persisted and plagued the home's next occupants, the unlucky Lutz family. They claim to have discovered, behind a bookcase, a sinister red room that was not included in the home's floor plan, and which the stalwart family dog would not enter. Or, so goes Hollywood's version anyway. But is there a similar gateway in the District of Columbia, beyond the White House's Red Room, previously mentioned as the preferred setting for Mary Todd Lincoln's spiritualist seances? For did you know that there is a stately home in Georgetown, which, while not as sensational as its New York counterpart, is nevertheless claimed to be the locus of recurring supernatural events. The federal-style building, known as Halcyon House, was built by the first U.S. Secretary of the Navy, Benjamin Stoddert. Halcyon House supposedly served as a crucial, though often deadly, link in the Underground Railroad during the antebellum portion of the Civil War era. Untold numbers of runaway slaves are claimed to have perished in Halcyon's cellar, starving and exhausted from crossing the Potomac River, and finally done in by the dismal dank of the basement air. Halcyon is, incidentally, just downstream from the reportedly cursed Three Sisters Islands. Numerous former residents and workers associated with Halcyon House have reported strange shapes, weird noises, and other perceptual trappings of alleged otherworldly encounters. At least one of these was a carpenter who had been hired to wall up a rat-infested basement tunnel. He was so haunted by the blood-curdling screams and sobbing that he claims to have heard while on the job that he would awaken in cold sweats from nightmares fully 60 years after the fact. By the way, for much more on DC's tunnel networks, look for Part 2 of our DC series. At the turn of the century, Halcyon House was acquired by an eccentric named Albert Adsit Clemens, who, perhaps after a supposed encounter with Benjamin Stoddart's ghost, adopted the belief that as long as he continued to build onto his earthly home, he would not die. The New York Times once reported that Mr. Clemens was a nephew of Mark Twain. If true, this is amusing, firstly since Twain, born Samuel Langhorne Clemens, was an inveterate skeptic who mocked the idea of ghosts and refused to believe in the unexplained. So it is strange, secondly, that the famed essayist, journalist, and satirist's old New York home at number 14 West 10th Street is allegedly haunted by 22 ghosts, including the spirit of Mark Twain himself. Still, doubter or not, the author of the novels The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn had a congenital relationship with synchronicity. You may remember that Mark Twain was born on November 30th, 1835, 2 weeks after the perihelion of Halley's Comet, and Twain died on April the 21st, 1910. 1 day after the same comet had once again reached its perihelion. The connection with Halley's Comet was incidentally anticipated by Twain himself. As for the peculiar perpetual building project of Mr. Albert Clemens, one may easily think of the so-called Winchester Mystery House. Although far removed in San Jose, California, its one-time owner, Sarah Winchester, widow of firearms manufacturer William Wirt Winchester, seems to have had thoughts along similarly odd lines. Evidently, she believed that her husband and only daughter, who both suffered untimely deaths, had been the victims of vengeful spirits of men who had been slain by Winchester rifles. A spirit medium suggested that she build a never-to-be-completed house in order to baffle and keep at bay the hostile spirits. Back on the East Coast, Halcyon House has been associated with a variety of paranormal phenomena. For instance, objects, such as an engraving which once hung over a fireplace, have occasionally been defaced and displaced, with no run-of-the-mill causal explanation at hand. Or again, there are multiple independent claims about occupants who are made to levitate in a second-floor bedroom. This latter factoid, of course, brings to mind the novel and the film The Exorcist. You'll recall that the plot involves a sometimes levitating, ostensibly demon-possessed character, whom, by the way, we mentioned in our short video, Blair. The Exorcist movie was mostly set and partially shot on location in Georgetown, Washington, D.C. Writers at the website Atlas Obscura punctuate this oddity, suggesting that sightseers looking for an extra dose of spooky should try visiting the Exorcist Stairs, which are located just 2 blocks west of Halcyon House. Fort McNair is one of the oldest military posts in the United States. Renamed in 1948 for Lieutenant General Leslie James McNair, who commanded the U.S. Army Ground Forces during World War II, it was evidently first used as an arsenal. In 1826, a penitentiary was built on its grounds, which was a grim place indeed. Because of disease at the facility, then-President Abraham Lincoln ordered the penitentiary closed in 1862. But as soon as Lincoln was murdered, the penitentiary was back in business. One of its prisoners was Mary Surratt, then accused and later convicted co-conspirator in the assassination of President Lincoln, April 14, 1865. Stay tuned for a bit more on that momentous event. On July 7, 1865, Surratt became the first woman to be executed by the United States federal government. For more on the tumultuous Civil War and Reconstruction eras, see our election fraud video. Historians still debate Surratt's guilt. We note the following. On the premises of Fort McNair, where Surratt met her maker, is the small, ordinary-looking Building 21. It was in this building that Mary Surratt was imprisoned. Incidentally, the number 21, which figured in the synchro mystique of 9/11, has a tragic reverberation in Fort McNair's history. On June 17, 1864, a horrific explosion ripped apart a munitions warehouse, killing 21 female workers and blinding or grievously injuring numerous others. The dead, many of whom were Irish immigrants, were so badly burned that they were identifiable only through jewelry. In his 1997 book Ghosts, True Encounters with the World Beyond, 20th century Austrian-American parapsychologist Hans Holzer reported that to this day, sobs are heard in the early hours of the morning by a number of people who've had dealings with the place. One, Mrs. C, whose name Holzer changed to shield her military identity, communicated to him that on several occasions, very late at night, someone or something could be heard walking above, even though she was on the top floor. Indeed, at least once, a window in the room which had been Mrs. Surratt's cell was continually being rattled, as if someone were trying to get in, or to get out, and there seemed to be a definite presence in the house. Of additional related interest is the fact that for a time, Surratt lived in Washington, D.C. in a townhouse that she ran as a boarding house, a kind of 19th century version of what today might be called an air bed and breakfast. The place was initially numbered 541 H Street, though it is now known as 604 H Street Northwest and has been repurposed as a Chinese restaurant. Back in the day, the Boston Post chronicled the fate of the house, including a succession of dissatisfied buyers and spooked tenants, laying blame on the fact that they thought they saw the ghost of Mrs. Surratt, clad in her execution robe, walking the corridors of her former home. Approximately 4 miles due north of the evidently ill-fated Mary Surratt's D.C. lodgings is the Rock Creek Churchyard. Established in 1719, it's the oldest cemetery in Washington. Sequestered there among holly bushes and ivy is the grave of Marion Hooper Clover Adams. The forbidding sculpture marking the spot bears no inscription, and it has no date. Erected in 1891, the Augustus St. Gaudens statue was commissioned to commemorate Clover by her husband, historian Henry Brooks Adams, who also happened to be a grandson of aforementioned 6th President John Quincy Adams and a great-grandson of the 2nd President John Adams. Again, we touched on the former in 10 Milestones in Election Fraud. Popularly referred to as Grief, the technically unlabeled and androgynous bronzework doesn't resemble Mrs. Adams at all. Speculation abounded that the brilliant 42-year-old amateur photographer had died by her own hand. Today, those conjectures seem to have been confirmed, whether through forensic study or sheer repetition, as multiple sources now agree that on December the 6th, 1885, she swallowed a vial of potassium cyanide, a chemical that she used to develop her photographs. It seems that the name game was in full vigor during Mrs. Adams' life and unfortunate death on St. Nicholas Day in her last fateful year. For more on that holy day, see Alias St. Nick. In that place, as well as in 10 Sex Magic Cults, we explained some of the importance of variants of nicknames, not least as a sobriquet for the devil. Nicknames, of course, is the coinage of our friend, paranormalist Jim Brandon, author of Weird America and Rebirth of Pan. We also have a relevant appendix to our Substack article on Christian Platonism, dealing with the subject of famed Dominican theologian St. Thomas Aquinas' ecstatic experience in the chapel of St. Nicholas, December 6, 1273. Additionally, although Henry and Marion were both born and married in Boston, Massachusetts, by 1877, the initially happy couple had relocated to Washington, D.C. There, they took up residence at the Slidell House, 1607 H Street, facing Lafayette Square, across from the White House. We alluded to the Fayette factor in our discussion of the neighboring Decatur House, and we will devote an entire video to the theme soon, so stay tuned. In the early 1880s, the Adamses purchased a lot with friend John Hay, which became the site of the Hay-Adams houses, two separate residences that shared a common facade. After Marion died, stories spread that visitors to the Adamses' Lafayette Square house were overcome with uneasiness and would not remain for long. It was said that occasionally at dusk, the sighs and bitter sobs of a woman crying could be heard from within. There were tales that in spite of the hottest fires, there was always a chill around the hearth, where Marion was found unconscious. In 1927, a Washington, D.C. developer, Harry Wardman, bought and razed the Adamses' home, replacing it with the Hay-Adams Hotel, which, according to the establishment's website, is an Italian Renaissance-style 138-room apartment hotel designed by architect Miron Mesrobian. Or, in a nutshell, it is a boutique hotel for the world's movers and shakers. Naturally, or I should say supernaturally, the Hay-Adams Hotel is now allegedly haunted by the spirit of Clover Adams, who is said to inhabit the 4th floor. Staff have experienced the mysterious opening and closing of locked doors, clock radios turning off and on by themselves, sounds of a woman crying in a room or in a stairwell, and a voice asking housekeepers, "What do you want?" heard in empty rooms. Incidents are most frequent during the first 2 weeks of December, around the anniversary of Clover's death. For the Weird Willard Intercontinental Washington, colloquially known as the Willard Hotel, stay tuned for future installments of our DC Oddities catalog. Of Marian Adams' apparition, it has been alleged that encounters often led to lasting feelings of despair in the percipient, as though the spectral woman could transfer her emotions although she never moved from her rocking chair. Disturbingly similar powers are attributed to the enigmatic Adams Memorial. Those who look upon its expressionless face frequently confess a sudden and overwhelming loneliness, or a sadness such as none they had ever previously known. While we're at it, we may as well mention that there are several related bootleg copies of St. Gaudens's grief statue. One, known as the Black Aggie, was originally made to sit upon the grave of Felix Agnes in Druid Ridge Cemetery in Pikesville, Maryland. The Black Aggie was once a sensation among teens, testing the myths that sitting on Aggie's lap at midnight brought instant death, or that staring into the statue's eyes would make them open and glow red. The stories grew. Pregnant women who passed through Aggie's shadow would miscarry. Spirits of the dead gathered around her. A college fraternity initiate required to spend the night on her lap was crushed to death by unseen forces when she came to life. So many thrill seekers broke into the cemetery, vandalizing the grounds, that officials finally donated Black Aggie to the Smithsonian American Art Museum with no further noted mythological mishaps. We should note that the parent Smithsonian institution is also the subject of controversy and speculation, from tales of hidden treasures to ghost sightings, legends that movie audiences have bumped up against in Hollywood movies like 2009's comedy Night at the Museum, Battle of the Smithsonian. However, it is important to note that Aggie has since been moved again. And it will probably come as no great surprise to attentive viewers when we observe that it is now standing in a courtyard behind, or adjacent to, the Dolley Madison house on, you guessed it, good old Lafayette Square. This change of scenery was effected by members of the Cosmos Club, who were at one time headquartered in a property next door, one that is now occupied by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. This led one lawyer to exclaim that the relevant two federal courts are among the most haunted places in Washington, D.C., at least according to popular legend. And that sounds about right. Technically in Arlington, Virginia, and so not part of Washington, D.C. proper, Arlington National Cemetery is nevertheless located just across the Potomac River at the end of Memorial Avenue. Because of its proximity and many connections to the District of Columbia, however, it seems a fitting mention. After all, it is the burial site for two U.S. presidents, William Howard Taft and John Fitzgerald Kennedy. The latter was laid to rest at Arlington amid much popular sadness following his assassination on November 22, 1963, as so far discussed in two of our past videos. On clear nights, a sharp-eyed observer might even be able to glimpse JFK's Eternal Flame Memorial just beneath the Lee Mansion from choice vantage points in Washington, D.C. Prior to its use as a cemetery, during the inappropriately named Civil War, it was part of the estate of George Washington Parke Custis, who built Arlington House in 1802. His daughter, Mary Anna Custis, married Army engineer and officer Robert Edward Lee in 1831, and the couple lived there for 3 decades, until the Union Army seized Arlington House May 24, 1861, roughly a month after Virginia's secession, following the highly symbolic attack on Fort Sumter, a man-made island off the coast of South Carolina near Charleston. On the wavelength of cryptogeometry, we note that circular stair towers served each angle of Fort Sumter. 3 of those were topped with octagonal cupolas, as pictured. Within 3 years, the Arlington estate would be piled so high with the corpses of America's youth that it had to be converted into a burial ground. Cemeteries have long been viewed as occult dynamos. A pressing question is, has the District of Columbia subsequently leveraged this cemetery power? Hold that thought for our next video. For now, Google reports that Arlington Cemetery has the remains of more than 400,000 military personnel and their eligible family members. That makes for a lot of potentially restless spirits. One particularly active spot seems to be the Old Post Chapel. Located on the adjacent Fort Myer, but serving as the ceremonial chapel for Arlington Cemetery, the place is rumored to be haunted. Those who have visited report hearing voices and footsteps, organ music at odd hours, and noticing unexplained open doors and cabinets that were supposedly locked. According to the website Virginia Haunted Houses, an apparition has been spotted in the bridal room, which was previously a private mourning area. According to legend, much of this activity may be due to Mary Custis Lee's ghost, even though she herself was reportedly buried in Lexington, Virginia, a 3-hour drive southwest. Of additional interest is what has been called one of the nation's most hallowed sites, namely the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, which serves as a symbolic grave for all war dead whose remains have not been found or identified. It should, however, not be confused with the separate monument for Civil War unknowns, and it stands in evident epistemic opposition to other memorials, such as the 47-foot-high D.C. War Memorial, that name what are routinely called the Glorious Dead, which ties it to what one writer referred to as a Tomb of Fame. Stay tuned, by the way, for more on the synchro-mystique of numbers, including 47. Dedicated November 11, 1921, and completed 10 years later, the tomb began as a commemoration of one unknown service member from World War I, and today is the grave of 3 unidentified soldiers. Although, since at least the late 1990s, one may read fretful forecasts that the then fledgling technology for DNA testing might put America's unknown soldier tradition in mortal danger. And, indeed, although there are 4 grave markers at the site, there are only 3 bodies, since the soldier who had been buried in the Vietnam crypt was later identified and returned to his family. Make what you will of the fact, according to PBS News, that the 100th anniversary of the tomb in 2021 also just happened to be the deadliest year in U.S. history. There may be a further connection to the uber-haunted U.S. Capitol, which building we already discussed. Legend has it that whenever a fallen soldier is laid in state in the huge rotunda, a transparent, World War I infantryman makes himself visible momentarily, just long enough to snap a crisp salute. Some people think the doughboy, as such troops were called, may be the very unknown soldier whose body is so famously entombed at Arlington Cemetery. Intriguingly, the counterpart British Tomb of the Unknown Warrior was dedicated, and the soldier therein given a state funeral, November 11, 1920, in Westminster Abbey. The recurring date, now commemorated annually in the United States as Veterans Day, but was originally Armistice Day, marks the formal cessation of conflict ending World War I at the 11th hour on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. Another common denominator between the British and American tombs was the presence of American General John Joseph Pershing, who was a part of the pageantry surrounding both memorials, and whose nickname was Blackjack. Additionally, David Railton, the Anglican chaplain who is credited with the idea of a Tomb of the Unknown Warrior, is said to have been inspired by a grave to an unknown British soldier of the Black Watch that he encountered while in northern France. As synchro-mystic pioneer James Shelby Downard pointed out in Part 1 of Jim Brandon's Sirius Rising audio recording, the Black Watch serenaded President John Fitzgerald Kennedy a mere 9 days before the latter was murdered in Dallas, Texas, and seemed to Downard to be a part of an extended funerary rite, which had elements of similarity with the killing of the king ritual as spelled out by Sir James Frazer. Of course, the leitmotif of an unknown knight goes back at least to the 12th century French troubadour Chrétien de Troyes and his Arthurian poem Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart. This connection is all the more interesting given John F. Kennedy's evident fascination with the King Arthur mythos, one modern retelling of which owes to 20th century British writer Terence Hanbury, T.H. White's 1958 compendium, The Once and Future King. In 1960, White's story was adapted into the stage production Camelot by librettist Alan J. Lerner and set to music by composer Frederick Fritz Loewe. On December 6, 1963, St. Nicholas Day, a fortnight after the assassination of the 35th U.S. president, Life magazine published an interview with Jacqueline Lee, Jackie Kennedy, later, of course, Jacqueline Onassis. In it, the president's widow drew attention to JFK's fondness for the musical's final lines. Don't let it be forgot that once there was a spot for one brief shining moment that was known as Camelot. The interviewer? A different T.H. White. 4 years after Dallas, Camelot was made into a feature-length film with actors Richard Harris and Vanessa Redgrave. Indeed, some of this was reintroduced into public consciousness as recently as 2016 with the release of the film Jackie. The titular character was portrayed by the popular Israeli-born actress Natalie Hershlag, known professionally as Natalie Portman. Not to put too fine a point on the broader connection, but Kennedy's eternal flame is a much-visited part of Arlington Cemetery and lies just north of the tomb of the Unknown Soldier Memorial. Evidently, the Unknown Knight moniker was adopted by an anonymous 17th century writer who published his hermetic investigations of nature under the pseudonym Le Chevalier Inconnu. This rather obscure datum might be an irrelevance were it not for the fact that the mysterious alchemist known only as Fulcanelli quoted from Le Chevalier Inconnu in his The Mystery of the Cathedrals, the writing and publication of which, originally in Paris, was contemporaneous with the construction of the tomb of the unknown soldier. But the body of the American soldier was selected during a ceremony in France. It was later reenacted, quote-unquote, in the United States. It had to do with placing of roses on a particular casket, and that may have raised the interests of someone like Dolley Madison. From the standpoint of this video, there is another odd synchronicity. And as a nod to that synchronistically timed and, according to People magazine's suspicious death of 95-year-old actor Eugene Allen Gene Hackman, as well as his 63-year-old wife, perhaps we could call this facet of the unknown soldier story the French connection? Incidentally, there seems to be a pervasive Scottish connection as well, which we hope to get into at some future time. Built in 1915, the House of the Temple is located at 1733 16th Street, Northwest, on the border of the Logan Circle and DuPont Circle neighborhoods, the latter also being home to the Woodrow Wilson House previously discussed. Incidentally, when the building's cornerstone was laid, October 18, 1911, a Reverend William Taylor Snyder, ostensibly a relation to the family responsible for the Octagon House previously described, gave the benediction. The building number, 1733, happens to be the year that Masonry first landed in America, as reckoned by the opening of the St. John's Lodge in Boston, Massachusetts. The heavily Egyptian-themed House of the Temple was nonetheless modeled upon Persian King Mausolus's tomb, the fabled Mausoleum at Halicarnassus, which was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The temple, which serves as the headquarters of the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, announces itself to be the home of the Supreme Council, 33rd degree. Even though its pedigree isn't quite so old, or quite so distinguished as other structures on our list, it has to be one of the best-known haunted buildings in Washington, D.C. Partly this may be due to the presence of the body of ex-Confederate General Albert Pike. Pike was pardoned after the Civil War by President Andrew Johnson, purportedly a fellow Mason. Albert Pike served as Sovereign Grand Commander of the Scottish Rite from 1859 until his death in 1891. We listed Pike, who almost single-handedly rewrote the book on Masonic ritualism, publishing his finalized solemnities under the title Morals and Dogma, as one of our top 10 occultists of all time. For more on the double-headed eagle symbolism, which appears on the cover of his book, and which some Masonic insiders have alleged is really a mythical double-headed phoenix, see our video on the 2025 DC mid-air collision. Some observers, even those sympathetic to the order, have speculated that Pike's body may have come with a sort of curse. This owes to the fact that Pike's wish to be cremated was totally disregarded by his brother Masons, who opted to bury him ceremonially instead. After Pike died, allegedly inside DC's first Masonic temple, which was at 9th and F Streets, he was interred at Washington, D.C.'s Oak Hill Cemetery. This cemetery first began as a final resting place for Georgetown residents in 1849. Over the years, many groundskeepers and ghost hunters have reported seeing a carriage hearse pulled by 6 headless horses around the Van Ness family mausoleum. Then, in 1944, Albert Pike's remains were exhumed from Oak Hill Cemetery and re-entombed in what is now known as the House of the Temple, the transfer being a thitherto unheard-of project reportedly requiring special permission from the U.S. Congress, as we will note again in a moment. Pike himself, of course, never set foot in the 16th Street address, which was constructed well after his passing. But that hasn't stopped speculation that the former Grand Commander's restless spirit, as well as his actual disintegrating physical remains and death mask, may be responsible for miscellaneous odd phenomena, such as access panel doors opening and slamming shut, interrupting late-night meetings, shadows seeming to move of their own accord, and sounds of footsteps eerily echoing off the ubiquitous marble without any obvious cause. Although not all of these odd experiences in the House of the Temple seem to point to the portly Masonic honcho. A recurring smell of pipe tobacco in certain back offices, for example, is thought to be due to John Henry Coles. Coles served as Sovereign Grand Commander for 31 years, from 1921 to 1952, during which time he actually lived in the House of the Temple. According to Scottish Rite Freemasons Matt Bowers and Maynard Edwards, Coles died in the House of the Temple, though a news clipping of Coles' obituary, available at the website findagrave.com, asserts that he passed away in a hospital. In any event, like his imposing 19th century predecessor, Pike, Coles is said now definitely to be interred in the walls of the House of the Temple, which, to hear Bowers and Edwards tell it, took an act of Congress in 1952 because it was then illegal to bury someone indoors. Our Masonic ghost chroniclers also claim to have electronic voice phenomenon recordings made in the House of the Temple and allegedly reflecting the voice of 20th century entertainer and Scottish Rite initiate Burl Ives. For their part, Bowers and Edwards disclaim any intention of, quote, toying with the occult. Although for many, quote, anti-Masons, such as American Christian polemicist John Edward Ed Decker, Masonry has elements of paganism and Luciferianism baked into it. Apart from the evangelical preachiness, it's hard to blame Decker for his reaction. Pike, in his largely unreadable magnum opus, Morals and Dogma, enthuses, quote, Lucifer, the light bearer, strange and mysterious name to give to the spirit of darkness, Lucifer, the son of the morning. Is it he who bears the light? Doubt it not. Of course, our brief list here has been selective, and these are not the only haunted spots in Washington, D.C. Some say that another jinxed location is Ford's Theater, where the 16th U.S. President, Abraham Lincoln, was killed. For a bit of the conspiratorial side of that affair, look for a short video in the near future. Alternatively, check out the appendix to the written version of this production, which is on our Substack, and we lay out there a number of basic points. But we have to draw the line somewhere, so for the time being, if you found something of interest, please click the like button. Don't forget to subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this, and please share the original link. As always, feel free to comment with your feedback, reactions, or topic suggestions. And don't forget to look for the second part of our series, where we will have much more to say about the dark curiosities and synchro mystique of Washington, D.C. So, stay tuned.